So this leads us to our third and final step in this process, testing for validity. So now that we've established that our measure of anxiety is relatively reliable, how do we know that it's actually measuring anxiety and not something else? So construct validity is the degree to which a measure of a conceptual variable actually measures that conceptual variable, right? So if I'm trying to measure anxiety and I have an anxiety measure, I want to make sure that it's measuring anxiety and not something else, right? And there are various types of construct validity, but I'm going to end up talking about two broad types, face validity and content validity. And within content validity, there are predictive validity, concurrent validity, convergent validity, and discriminant validity. They're all kind of similar, but you're going to need to be able to distinguish between them for the exam. Um, let's start out talking about face validity. This is the easiest one. So basically, does the measure that you've developed, does it look like it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? So on face value, does it look like it's measuring, our anxiety measure is measuring anxiety? So if there are questions about do you feel anxious, that seems like on face value that it's measuring anxiety. Whereas if you ask questions like, do you like sports? That's not a question that has anything to do with anxiety. So on face value, that would be a poor measure of validity. Now, face validity is probably the poorest measure of validity. It might be a good first step just to make sure that your questions seem like they're getting at the construct of interest, but it's not at all the best way of measuring validity. Which leads us to content validity. This is the degree to which a measure captures the content of a particular construct of interest. So is it capturing all of that content or a construct, or is it just capturing some small component of it? So what you want to get a sense of is how well is that particular measurement or measure capturing that broad construct or conceptual variable. So the first type of validity I'm going to talk about is predictive validity. So this refers to the extent to which a survey measures or can forecast future outcomes or behavior. So future behavior. So think about like the SAT. It is trying to predict future college performance, right? So you want to get a sense of how well does your particular measure measure people's performance or outcomes in the future. So that is predictive validity. The key word there is predictive. Can it predict future outcomes? Concurrent validity looks at the correlation between a new measure of a particular construct with an established measure of that same construct. So if we want to develop this new measure of anxiety, we would give participants our new measure of anxiety along with a pre-existing measure of anxiety, with the idea being that our new measure of anxiety should be highly correlated with this pre-existing established measure of anxiety. So the more highly correlated they are, the more valid our new measure is. If our measure is not at all correlated with the measure that's been shown to measure anxiety, then it doesn't give us a lot of confidence that we're actually measuring anxiety. Another type of validity is convergent validity. It's very similar to concurrent validity, but there's one important distinction which I'll describe. So again, here you're trying to look at the relationship between two different measures of the same construct, but here you have using two different measurement procedures or methods. So I could give people our new measure of anxiety, which is a self-report measure, and then also have people observe people who are anxious and see if that it's highly correlated. So if our self-report measure of anxiety, so I say I'm anxious, and people report that I'm looking anxious, that would give me confidence that my self-report measure is actually capturing anxiety. The key here is that you have two different types of measurements. So one is self-report, one is behavioral, right? So that's the important component when you're talking about convergent validity. So to give you a little bit of visual, we have our measure of anxiety, which is self-report. We also measure some kind of behavior measure of anxiety, so maybe how fidgety um, observers report that the people are being. So if people are reporting feeling anxious and observers are reporting that they look fidgety, that would give us confidence that our measure of anxiety is actually measuring anxiety. So we want a high correlation between our measure of anxiety and those reports of the people looking, acting fidgety. Then the last type of validity I'm going to talk about is discriminant validity. So this is the extent to which scores on our new measure of anxiety are unrelated to variables that should be unrelated to anxiety. So you're trying to discriminate between your particular measure and some measure that's kind of like the opposite of what you're supposed to be measuring. So, for example, we can give people our anxiety scale, and then give them some kind of a measure that measures the opposite of anxiety. And the idea being, since those two variables should be negatively correlated, when we measure them, they should be negatively correlated. And if our measure of anxiety is negatively correlated with the measure that is shown to be the opposite of anxiety, then that gives us confidence that we're also measuring anxiety. So to give you a visual, let's say we want to look at, we know that on a conceptual level, anxiety is negatively correlated with being relaxed. So then we have to find a measure, use our measure of anxiety, and also give people a measure that taps into relaxation, with the idea being that when we ask them both types of measures, they should be negatively correlated because conceptually they're negatively correlated. So when we actually measure them with our measure of anxiety and this established measure of relaxation, they should be negatively correlated. If they are, that gives us a high level of discriminant validity, which suggests that we're potentially tapping into anxiety. Now, if our measure of anxiety was positively correlated with this measure of relaxation, that would suggest that our measure of anxiety is not actually measuring anxiety, it's measuring something else because it should be negatively correlated with this established measure of relaxation. So to recap, we've covered a lot today. These are all important things. So when I'm kind of highlight the things you really need to know, to study a conceptual variable, you must first operationalize that variable, right? And then there are 4 types of measures and 4 different types of measurement scales. So know the different types of measures, know the different types of scales, be able to distinguish between them. Then after you have operationalized your variable, you have to test for reliability. And then once you've established reliability, you then need to test for validity. So just remember that the first step is operationalizing your variable, then test for reliability, test for validity.